there, and welcome back. I'm Roy Gerstenberger from First Person Services, and this is Delovely, a podcast featuring conversations with people who are creative, curious, and committed to building whole communities where diversity and inclusion is celebrated. I think that it's fair to say that one central feature of the social justice project in our country is the recognition that choice and decision-making is at the core of what it means to be free. In order to have agency and power in the world, in order to be part of the franchise of democracy, you need to lift up the capacity for choice and decision-making for all. Yet we know that in the process of describing or defining disabilities, clinicians often shine a light on this question of a person's capacity to make decisions. And like so many other things that get caught up in the definition of disabilities, the role that environment and context plays can get ignored or disregarded. This is a mistake. An enlightened way of looking at decision-making is to recognize that it's something that everyone does with some amount of support. It's something that builds through the experience of mistakes and missteps. And it's something that's influenced a great deal by expectation, which means that privilege and social hierarchy inevitably comes into play when we cast judgment on another person or a marginalized group of people around choice and decision-making rights. Supported decision-making is something that my guest today has spent many years exploring and advancing. You may know Jonathan Martinis as the attorney for Jenny Hatch, a woman who, at the request of her parents, was placed in a group home, where they took away her cell phone and laptop and wouldn't let her go to her job or see her friends. After a year of litigation, Jenny won back her right to make her own decisions, using supported decision-making. She wrote the foreword to a new book by Jonathan. You may also know him as the Senior Director for Law and Policy with the Burton Blatt Institute at Syracuse University. He also serves as the co-project director of the National Resource Center for Supported Decision-Making that's led by the Quality Trust for Individuals with Disabilities. I had the good fortune of meeting Jonathan when he agreed to come and launch the State Supported Decision-Making Task Force in 2015 to design coordinated strategies to advance and strengthen the availability of supported decision-making to all who wish to use it. Its members represented a wide array of stakeholders with knowledge about the systems that provide legal, services, and support to students, elders, and peer networks. It was great to catch up with Jonathan recently. We talked by phone. Listen in. Jonathan, welcome to the Delovely podcast. Thanks so much for being our guest today.
Thank you for having me, Roy.
Jonathan, you have a new book out called From Justice for Jenny to Justice for All. Everyone has the right to make choices. And one of the things that you're quoted as saying is that Jenny's story should be the beginning of the story. Can you tell us a little bit about what you mean by that?
Well, yes. And Jenny Hatch was a young woman that I'm really honored to call a friend first and foremost. But I worked with Jenny to help her get out of a guardianship that she never needed and never wanted. And we can talk about Jenny's story more later if you'd like. But what I mean by saying that her story should be the beginning is this. If all we're going to talk about is one person's experience, if the whole point of the book or the whole point of supported decision-making or the whole point of Jenny Hatch is that one person had an experience, and it's a marvelous experience and a great story. But if that's all we're talking about, then it's just a great story. It has stories can be great. They can be inspiring. They can be emotional. But we can't end there. We can't end with the story of Jenny Hatch ending well. And it does end well. She's having a life like she wanted, a life like you and I have. But if that's the end of the story, in the end of the day, what does it matter? So that's what I mean, is that we have to take from Jenny's experience a lesson that goes like this. Everyone has the right to make choices to the maximum of their ability. Everyone has the right to be in charge of his or her life to the maximum of their ability. And if that's not the message we take out of Jenny's story, then we're only talking about one person. When what we should be talking about is everyone and how everyone can learn from Jenny's story, how everyone can emulate Jenny's story, and how everyone can be the driving force, the center of his or her own life.
That reminds me of the framing that we have in the disability community, which is disability is a natural part of the human experience. So when we are talking about everyone needs the capacity to have control and choice over their own lives, that is something that allows us to reflect on our own experience of needing support for decisions.
Of
And
course.
and that how that changes depending upon circumstance and how we grow and learn. So supported decision making really flowed out of this, didn't it?
Of course it did. I mean, I want you to think for a second, and if you are a person who is interested in rights, I'm not talking about disability rights, I mean rights, you'll understand that the very first sentence of the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990 goes like this. Just because you have a physical or a mental disability, it does not impact in any way your right to be a full and equal member of your community. And we start there. And the sad irony is that sentence is in a law from 1990. We all learned in grade school in 1776, Thomas Jefferson said, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all people are created equal and we all have right to the life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It took 214 years for America to get around to realizing and protecting the rights of people with disabilities, to say that they have the exact same rights as everyone else, the exact same rights that we were talking about in the American Revolution. So the idea of supported decision-making, the idea of anything that is designed to ensure that people with disabilities have the same rights as everyone else flows directly from there. There is a straight line from, if you're a classicist, from Plato and Aristotle to John Locke in Great Britain to Thomas Jefferson, and then finally to the Americans with Disabilities Act, and then 23 years after that to Jenny Hatch saying, I am a person who has a right to be a full and equal member of my community. And that means I get to choose how I am a member of my community. I get to work with the people I choose who will help me be a full and equal member of the community. That's what makes rights useful. Without choice and without support, then rights are just words.
Do we have reason to be hopeful, though, Jonathan? You said that there are some sad elements to this democratic project or experiment we're all a part of, where it has taken a long time. But I was noting that 10 states have passed laws that recognize supported decision-making now. And
it's actually 10 states plus District of Columbia, so it's 11, and there are more in the works.
And there's also, I would say, largely due to the work that you do and others that are involved in the project with the Quality Trust for Individuals with Disabilities, but there are 40 states that are involved in some sort of projects around this. It seems that every time I turn around and look at another newsletter, there's another significant project out there. So you have seen some progress.
Absolutely. But first, let me say you're incredibly kind and generous to give me any of that credit. I think the credit for this movement goes to, first and foremost, people with disabilities who are demanding equal rights. I mean, we can trace that movement back to the 60s and 70s, to people having crawl-ins, they called it, or demanding justice, to the first people who formed Centers for Independent Living, who protested outside Congress until they passed regulations implementing the Rehabilitation Act. So I consider myself a mouthpiece, and if I'm a fairly effective one, that's great. But yes, to answer your question, I think there is an incredible movement right now. It has only been 7 years since the Jenny Hatch case. It's only been 7 years since a court first said that this person can use supported decision-making to protect and enhance her rights instead of having all of her rights taken away in a guardianship. And in just those 7 years, as you pointed out, 10 states plus D.C. have passed laws. And if you've been in this field long enough, you know that nothing ever moves that fast. I have never seen anything in my entire career ever move like this and take root like this. And you're correct. Since Jenny's case, I've probably been in over 40 states, and I think all of them have some type of understanding or movement toward recognizing and implementing supported decision-making. I'm part of projects right now in New York and Virginia and California, Ohio. I finished one up in Tennessee that are designed to give people opportunities. In Vermont, I mean, Mr. Gerstenberger, you know this. You and I were part of the very first project, I believe, in the country to implement supported decision-making systemically. And it's because of that, the people who are involved directly in making it happen, that it is happening. And I have great hope that it's going to continue to happen, whether or not laws are passed. I don't think that laws are necessary or necessarily the sum total of this movement. I think it's people saying, this is what I want, people saying, I'm going to have this, and you can't take it away from me. That's the most important thing we can have, is knowledge and desire and implementation. Laws will take care of themselves. It's the people who drive it that are the most important.
That's fascinating. It sounds like if the norms shift and the expectations shift over time, then you have attorneys coming out of law school and becoming judges that would naturally think of broader options than what unfortunately we had historically, where it was either full guardianship or nothing at all. So it's a mindset shift, it sounds like you're referring to.
That's absolutely what I believe. And again, you and I know from our history together, but so much of what I do came out of Vermont. I worked with someone, again, you know, still do, named Jessalyn Gustin, who works out of an agency called Upper Valley Services. And she coined a phrase that I use all the time. And it's this. It's what we need to do is change culture. We don't necessarily need to change laws. Laws are pretty good. And we can talk about state laws that I can say already have supported decision-making as a required component, whether or not they use those words. But it's the culture that we have. Again, if you're a classicist, and I call myself that instead of nerd, although nerd would make sense as well, I can tell you that 1,500 years ago, the very first time we wrote the laws down in the Western world, the Eastern world has us beat by thousands of years, but in the Western world, they put the laws together into a code called the Code of Justinian. Again, the first codification of laws. One of those laws said, if you are feeble-minded, their words, you had to have a curator over you to make your decisions for you. So just like that, in our first book of laws, we started a culture and an expectation. Disability equals inability. Limitation equals you have to lose everything. That's the culture that we have followed for 1,500 years. And again, like you said, when people, when professionals, when attorneys, when judges start to see through what I call that cultural smokescreen, to see that there are and should be other options, one of which, by the way, could be guardianship. I'm not here to say there should never be guardianship. It's fine when it's appropriate. But we shouldn't be jumping at things without thinking first. Think of it this way. Think about all the cliches we have in our lives about thinking about our decisions. Don't go off half-cocked. Don't make a snap decision. Don't, make an informed choice. All of those mean that we should think about things before we do them first. All of them mean also that we should get help making our decisions. We should find information we need. And that's just what supported decision making is, whether it's done by people with disabilities or without them. It's getting information so you can make the best possible decision. So that's the culture we need, one that assumes that there is no sin in getting help, one that realizes that that's a virtue because people without disabilities are complimented for getting help. They are told they should use support before they do things. Where culture has to change is where people with disabilities get that same benefit. Where when a person like Jenny Hatch says, I'm not sure I understand what you're talking about, help me out here, or give me some information so I can choose myself because I don't understand what I need right now, that we look at that as a virtue, that's a good thing instead of assuming that means she can't do anything. And that way we'll get away from what I call reflexive guardianship, where it's the norm or the only option, and toward thinking about how we empower people best.
Interesting. I am fascinated about, and I would like to return to this idea of the change happens when we are able to explore and listen to the voice of people with disabilities, where that voice is heard. So I'm interested in your experience with self-advocates in that regard. I know that Jessalyn Gustin speaks about that often, and that's a strong element of the system that we have here in Vermont. So self-advocates or people with disabilities shift the culture. They're kind of the foundation for that, as are parents. And of course, they're significant players in this process, as they were with the Jenny Hatch project. But I'm curious about your experience in working with either parent groups, an audience of parents, and what that dialogue is like, and also with self-advocates. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Sure, but first a confession is that I spent a long time being a hypocrite. Because if you'd have asked me even 10 years ago what I did for a living, I would tell you I was a lawyer for people with disabilities. I represented people with disabilities. I fought for people with disabilities. I bragged about that, okay? I'm that guy. I am the defender of the rights of people with disabilities. And it took people like Jessel and Gustin, and really one person who hammered it home to me was Ari Naaman of the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network, that when you talk like that, when you envision yourself like that, really, how far away is it from saying I do things instead of people with disabilities, or I do things in the place of them, or I know what's best for them? Mm-hmm. So I was guilty of the exact same hypocrisy, well-meaning regardless, guilty of the exact same attitudes. And it took people, and it was self-advocates, it was people with disabilities saying, no, listen to me. Listen to what I want first. Nothing about us without us isn't just a snappy saying. It's actually not just common sense. It's common courtesy. Mm-hmm. Because all of us are taught from, again, a young age, like, what's the golden rule? Do unto others as you would have done unto yourself. Well, I got a platinum rule for you. We should do unto others as they would have done unto them, and that requires listening to them. And that requires, first and foremost, the common courtesy and dignity of listening to what a person wants. And Jenny Hatch brought that home to me. Again, I've been practicing the disability law for a very long time, and I never thought about guardianship, never. I was victim of the perpetrator, not victim, of the same culture that others were. And then this young woman, who I call the world's most petite giant, she's about 5'1", she says to me, I'm in guardianship, I don't want this. I want to make my own choices. I want to work where I want to work. I want to live where I want to live. I want to see the people I want to see. And I've got a guardian that won't let me do it. I've got a guardian that won't let me go to my church. She says, we go to this church, get used to your new life. I want to see my friends. No, make new friends, get used to your new life. I want to go back to my job where I'm welcome. No, we work over here, get used to your new life. Imagine someone saying that to you, saying, I want to do a podcast today. No, you can't. Get used to your new life. Mm-hmm. Wouldn't you take up arms? You would, metaphorically speaking, you would fight like hell against that. Sure. And that only comes from the person with disability saying, this is what I want, and someone being willing to listen. And like I said, I don't think I was willing to listen for a long time. And I'm never going to make that mistake again. I'm going to spend the rest of my career and life, I think, trying to make up for that. And with regard to parents, I think parents, I talk to parents a lot, and parents are getting a ton of pressure, let me tell you. Parents are being told to seek guardianship by people they trust. The number one referral source for guardianship, I was part of a study on this. We asked people where they were first told or suggested they get guardianship. Number one resource was teachers telling a parent, your child's going to turn 18 if you've gotten guardianship yet. Doctors, lawyers, friends, if people you trust are telling you this cultural pressure, this is something you have to do, like it is a rite of passage, what are you supposed to do? It is hard to be a parent. It's hard to be a parent of anyone. I have 2 kids, and they're doing their best to kill me, and I'm going to outlast them, I swear to you.
That's a journey too.
Right. But if you're a parent of a person with disabilities, you have to be so much more than a parent. You have to be the teacher, the healthcare advocate, often the lawyer, because you're the only thing in between your child and that. And there's so much your child needs. So when I talk to parents, I start there, okay? Because if a parent is saying, I want guardianship, the first thing I say to the parent is, what do you want for your child? What is your ultimate goal for your child? And every parent tells me some variation of the same theme. They say something like this. I want my child to be as happy as possible, as safe as possible, and independent as possible. Mm-hmm. And once I hear that, I say, okay, we can talk. Let's talk about that. Because I can tell you, Roy, that we have 40 years of studies, literally going back to the 70s, that say that when people with disabilities have more control over their lives, when they make more choices, when they have more self-determination is the clinical phrase, they have better lives. People with disabilities with more self-determination have been found in study after study after study to be safer, more independent, more involved in their communities, more likely to be employed, more likely to have friends, more likely to practice the religion of their choice. And we have study after study showing this. So I say to parents, what's the rush? If you know that what's standing in between your child having that and maybe not having that is being in guardianship and losing their rights, maybe guardianship is necessary, but what's the rush? Let's try something else. Let's try to empower first and see what happens. It doesn't work. Guardianship's always there. And I will tell you, I've only had one parent ever leave my office still wanting guardianship, because parents want the best for their children. Yes, they want their children safe, but they want the best for their children. So when you talk and you find out what's important to them, just like you find out what's important to the person with disabilities, you can work with that and you can hopefully make good things happen.
Isn't some of that question that's proposed to parents, or the proposition that's presented to parents about you should consider guardianship, isn't some of that driven by timetables in the law?
I think it's driven by misunderstandings of the law.
I see.
Okay, so without getting too deep in the weeds, I can tell you what is driving the teachers giving that advice.
Yeah.
Under the special education law, which is called the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, the school is required, federal law requires this, when the student turns 17, to inform the parent that in 1 year the student will be 18 and a legal adult, and the student will have the same rights as a legal adult. Now, there's nothing magical about that, because when I turned 18, I got all of the rights of a legal adult. There was just no law telling the school to tell my parents. I mean, if you think about it, unless you are very different from the norm, Roy, when you were 18, you weren't ready to be an adult either. I know I wasn't. So if someone had told my parents he's going to get the legal rights as an adult, my parents might have thought maybe he's not ready. So the same is true of people with disabilities. It's just you're going to have your rights at 18. The unfortunate thing is a misunderstanding of that law, because so many teachers say, and I have heard this in every state I've been in, and I am in many states, so many teachers will then follow that with, and unless you get guardianship at 18, you won't be able to be involved in your child's life. You won't be able to come to an IEP meeting. You won't be able to see your child's medical records. You won't be able to be informed if something happens. And that is just untrue. Because every legal adult, every 18-year-old has the right to say, I want my mom and dad at my IEP meeting. I want my mom and dad to come to the doctor with me. I want my mom and dad to be informed if something happens to me. So it's like saying that somehow the 18-year-old gets his or her legal rights, but doesn't have the right to exercise them by saying, I want someone with me, which is simply untrue. We can all sign an authorization. We do it every time we go to the doctor. Every time we go to the doctor, we sign what's called a HIPAA release, where we give the doctor permission to share information with someone if we want. An 18-year-old can just write someone's name in, and just like that, you've given that option. Same with the school. You can sign what's called a FERPA release, or in the District of Columbia, and I believe Vermont was moving toward this, you can sign an educational power of attorney or an educational supported decision-making agreement that says proactively, yes, I want mom and dad to come to my IEP meetings, and I want them to have access to my information. FERPA is a federal law that I believe the acronym is the Federal Education Rights and Privacy Act. HIPAA is the healthcare law that says that doctors can't share a person's information with anyone and without permission. FERPA is just like HIPAA, only for education. It says that schools can't share education records with anyone without permission. So the key part of that phrase is without permission. If I am an 18-year-old with all my rights, I can give permission. In fact, every IEP meeting notice I've ever seen in my life says at the top, you can invite whoever you want to the meeting. So to tell a parent that you can't come to IEP meetings unless you're guardian is just wrong, because that 18-year-old can say, I want mom and dad there. Simple as that.
So what's interesting about that as you're speaking, Jonathan, is I'm thinking that the practice of decision-making, and I guess that's an odd way for me to phrase it, but we make choices, we make decisions, as you say. When I was 18, although I was a legal adult, I was not prepared to make all my decisions on my own. I needed support. I relied heavily on my parents, and I made a lot of mistakes. But we tend not to recognize that also by the time I was 18, because I was privileged in many ways, I had practice. There was an expectation that I'd be making decisions. So I had practice from a very young age of people giving me choices and giving me information and letting me choose. And that kind of intentional practice or an intentional learning process is something that we're just starting to pay attention to for people who experience disabilities, it seems.
You know, you're 100% right. And by the way, your use of the word practice is truly 100% right. And this is what I mean by that. There are studies that show the common sense concept that decision-making is a skill, that with practice and opportunity, we get better at it. That's not rocket science. We all know that little children make bad decisions. They touch hot stoves. But because they had opportunity and experience, they learn to make better decisions. So decision-making is a functional skill. No one is born making good decisions. And a diagnosis doesn't change that. Experiencing disability does not change the benefits of opportunities to make decisions. I'll give you a very specific example. Again, Jenny Hatch. Jenny Hatch has a diagnosis of Down syndrome. I'm not a fan of IQ, but her measured IQ is quite low. So the very first time I took her to a psychologist, someone who I was hoping to testify on our behalf to show that Jenny makes decisions for herself, that psychologist gave her an IQ test and said, with this IQ, there's no way she can make decisions. Then he said he was stumped, so he went to lunch, and she went with him to lunch. He wanted to talk to her more. And when he came back from lunch, he said, oh, my goodness, she makes her own decisions. She looked both ways before she crossed the street. She ordered her own food. She paid for it. She counted her change. She took care of her hygiene. She didn't talk to strangers. We had pleasant conversation. And then she was very careful walking back because she had opportunities. Because decision-making is a function of opportunities. And I stress this to judges and to doctors and to attorneys, that when we are analyzing whether a person has, the legal term is capacity or competence, I hate both of them, but when we're judging that, we shouldn't be looking at measures like IQ. We should be looking at functional abilities. How does a person truly perform in decision-making situations? To use a shorthand, it doesn't, because you may not know who the President of the United States is or who the 15th President of the United States is, doesn't mean you can't make decisions. And yet our capacity evaluations are on things like those kind of knowledge tests or math questions about money. What it should be is watching a person and seeing what their functional abilities are, judging how they do things and whether they need help to do other things and whether they have access to that help. Last version I'm going to tell you of that, Roy, is the last time I testified in a case. It was a guardianship case, and a psychologist testified that this young woman needed a guardianship because he asked her how much money she had in her bank account, and she didn't know. And my response was, I don't know either. But you know what I have? I have an app. I can find out what my balance is. And I asked this young woman what she did. She said, she punched up her website, and there was her balance. So she had access and knew how to use it. That's what decision-making is. It's a skill. She had to learn that, and she could only learn that by having the opportunity to do it. So rather than assuming a person can't, for example, manage money because they don't know how much they have in their account, shouldn't we be asking how they manage money and what their process is for doing it, and do they have the support they need to do it? That's the real question.
A very different question.
Right. It's a question that requires us to think past culture, because ever since the Justinian Code, we've assumed that limitation equals inability, which is a sin if you think about it, because we all have limitations. Now,
Right.
I'm so sorry for sermonizing, but I myself, and you've heard me say this, I'm terrible at math. So I've got a career where I don't do math. I have skills that I use so that I can avoid my limitations. But for people with disabilities, society looks at a limitation and says that limitation means they can't do anything else. And that leads to losing rights, and it leads to attitudes that have assumptions about what people can and can't do. And assumptions are very dangerous things.
And it seems that it highlights even further how one way to look at and even define disability is to look at the environment. It's the environment that can be disabling as opposed to the person.
Of course. And thank you for saying that. Capacity, again, to use that phrase, is not a yes or no question, because unless you have a medical license, you do not have the capacity to manage your own health, because you can't diagnose yourself and you can't prescribe medication.
Right.
What you do have is the assistance of a doctor, and that's why they're there. So you are disabled, quote unquote, without that doctor because you can't manage your health. So shouldn't we be asking the same questions for people who are diagnosed as having disabilities? Not what does Down syndrome mean to you, but what can you use to overcome the limitations that we all have and that you experience specifically? That's what I mean.
Interesting. Turning to the experience that you have, and just looking at this statistic that I quoted before, that the projects centered on the issue of supported decision making are taking hold in about 40 states. I think you said that you're probably involved with all of them. I'm going to guess that the degree of success for those projects are going to be linked to the degree to they have involvement with self-advocates and groups who can have that voice in the room. Is that a fair assumption?
That's how I feel. I mean, again, getting deep into the weeds, many of the projects that I'm involved in also have a research component. Because even though it sounds like common sense that making more decisions leads to greater self-determination, and like I told you, greater self-determination is already linked with improved quality of life by study after study, what we're doing is we're doing studies with consent of the people we're working with, where people with disabilities using supported decision-making are the primary voices. The goals in these projects is one I'm doing in Virginia. It's ongoing right now, is that we are working with people with disabilities and people they choose, their supporters, so that they can set up their own supported decision-making plans. In other words, to say, these are areas in my life where I want support. These are the people I want to support me, and this is how I want to be supported. That is the decision of the person with disabilities. And then put that plan into action. And then periodically, we ask some questions. We have some instruments we've developed, that's the research term, that can measure how a person's self-determination is impacted. What we want to show, what we hope and expect to show after a year, is that by making their own decisions, by being that person in charge, it is associated with an improvement in quality of life, an improvement in being in the community, an improvement in making decisions, an improvement in wanting to make more decisions. Because if we can show that, then really, shouldn't we be saying we should try supported decision-making first? Why shouldn't we try it first? That's the goal here, is to give people the most possible rights so that they can say, I want to do it this way. Just like we all have the right to say that. Again, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And given that option, if we can tie that to a better quality of life, then I dare anyone, any judge, anyone else to say that people shouldn't be the driving forces in their life, that they shouldn't have their voice heard first.
It sets the standard, it sounds like, that really systems, administrators, judges, people with power need to be compelled to move in this direction in many ways.
Yeah, I do feel that way. And again, sorry to harken back to it, but it's culture.
Sure.
In Jenny's case, I will say this till the day I die. Before I got involved in it, the judge was quoted as saying in one hearing that one of his nephews had the same quote-unquote condition as Jenny, and that he wanted him to be protected. And that was his focus on protection. By the end of that trial, a year later, He became the first judge in a trial to say that a person has rights to make her own decisions, that Jenny should be empowered to make her own decisions using supported decision making, after we showed that that's what she does. And that means that given examples, given education, given outreach, people's minds can change. And to me, it's not a hard lift to show that people want things and that they do things better. And then saying to society, see, it works. That is the goal of so many of these projects.
I really want people to be encouraged to go and get the book, From Justice for Jenny to Justice for All. Everyone has the right to make choices. It sounds like if we're not involved in one of these larger projects, you described at one time the purpose of the book is to give people an easy to follow guide so that they know how to find the support they need to maintain their independence. So it's directed, it seems, to individuals with disabilities and their circles of support, their loved ones, the people who are involved in their lives. How else would you like to see this book used, Jonathan?
Thank you so much, Roy, for that. The name of the book is Supported Decision Making, From Justice for Jenny to Justice for All. We self-published it on Amazon because, to be very honest, all of the things that I saw on this topic cost a whole bunch of money and seemed to be aimed at academics. I mean, if you Google my name on Amazon, you'll find a textbook I co-wrote that's going for about anywhere from $90 to $100. And it's for graduate level students about theory and practice of supported decision making. And I'm not going to take anything away from graduate level students, but the people who need information on supported decision making are the people who are going to use it. People with disabilities, their families, their supporters. So what we did, and I insisted on this, was put it out ourselves at a reasonable price so that people could actually access it. And I made sure that it wasn't over academic. The one time we showed this to a publisher, the publisher gave a whole bunch of notes like, don't use contractions or don't use too many analogies. They're not, academic friendly. Well, I didn't want a book to be academic friendly. I wanted it to be people friendly. I wanted people who could use it, the people who I say are on the front lines of supported decision making, to have resources. So we wrote this book with two things in mind. One was to tell Jenny's story, and the first, 3 chapters are about her story. But like I said, that's where it begins, not where it ends. Because the rest of the book is specifically for people with disabilities and families and supporters on how they can use and implement and seek supported decision-making in their lives in the very programs that people use every day. So there was a chapter on using supported decision-making in special education, language you can use, resources you can use, draft letters you can write. There was a chapter on using supported decision-making to manage money, another on using it in healthcare, another on bringing it all together called the Culture of Coordinated Support Model that, again, you, Roy, and Jess Gustin in Vermont piloted, and chapters on next steps for supported decision-making. But the whole idea was to put in one place, in user-friendly language, a way for people to do it. Because that's the number one question I get when I speak, and I speak a lot, as you can probably imagine from the way I'm speaking now. People say, I buy in. Good idea, Jonathan. How do I do it? What's step one? What's step two? Where's an app? And I always say there isn't one and there shouldn't be one, because we all do things differently. And that's something that's common sense. We all know how to make decisions, but we all do it differently. We all get help at different times. So this book is designed to help people explore when they might want help, who they might want help from, and then how to get that help in the various spheres of life. So that, again, we're not just talking about Jenny. It's justice for all. It's opportunity for all. That's where we have to move if we want the culture to change.
Well, it sounds like a great step two to me. After listening to this podcast, go out and purchase that book and explore it and have conversations with others and pass it along. Jonathan, I want to thank you for spending the time that you have. I know that you're very busy. It's been great to talk with you today, and I hope our paths cross again in the near future.
Roy, it would be my honor to do so. And to anyone listening to this, if you ever have any questions, want to discuss supported decision-making or anything else, please do. That is the only way we're going to move forward, is if we ask questions, if we challenge each other, if we say, I tried this and it didn't work, what else can I try? Or I tried this and it did work, you should give it a try. So I want to invite anyone out there, if they have any questions about this or want to discuss, email me. My email address is somethingelsejm, as in Jonathan Martinez, @gmail.com. Or find me on Facebook, Jonathan Martinis, Martinis. You'll find a picture of me and Jenny on the front. And then we can talk and we can find ways to change the culture, because that's how we change the world. Thank you so much, Roy.
You bet. Take care, Jonathan.
Have a great one. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Well, that's it for our episode for today. Find out more about the Delovely podcast, including the page specifically dedicated to this episode, and our guest today, with some extra credit information about the various topics that we covered. I think you'll really like it. Also, Delovely is sponsored by listeners like you. Pitch in to keep this podcast going strong, highlighting people who are supporting whole communities. Find us at patreon.com/Delovely. Some levels of support can get you a regular guest feature or some digital audio support for your nonprofit. Take a look today, and thank you.